On this edition of Cheap Seats Chat Review, we will be reviewing literature because I will be talking about the book. Hello again, my name is Jason Burgos, and this is Cheap Seats Chat Review of the book I just showed you, and that is Dan Jones's The Templars. Look at that beast. Look at that big thing. Look at that. The thick-sized book of information right there for you, right here. I mean, it's fantastic read. I'm a big fan of history. I loved things about, the 11th century, 13th century, 12th century, 14th century, all that kind of stuff, the era of the Crusaders. And this book is all about that kind of story, especially because it's focusing on the Knights Templar. Now, I became a fan of things like the Knights Templar because I'm a conspiracy guy, but, mainly the reason the Ridley Scott movie, The Kingdom of Heaven. I mean, some of you may have seen it. Pretty good movie. Orlando Bloom stars in it in his post-Pirates of the Caribbean days. It's like any Ridley Scott movie. Good action, some solid acting, some good visuals. But the one thing about this movie is it's not the most factually accurate thing in the world. It's sort of like a Marvel Comics or DC movie where they take two characters and they make it an amalgamation of each other to make it interesting, and that's kind of what happens in that movie with the antagonist. What's great about the Dan Jones book is it really gives you the nitty-gritty details of really what the Knights Templar are all about. And it's this kind of stuff because they were a key part and a key factor in the Crusades, but there's so much more, and it's so much more in depth, and it's so much more fascinating than that. Not to give away too much, but if you like history, you're going to like this because the Knights Templar, this group that formed as just a pious defender of pilgrims going to the Holy Land, became this major paramilitary force in the Catholic Church and working for the Vatican and working for many kings and queens and emperors of its time. The great thing about the group is that they come into contact with so many of the key, historical figures of that 1100s to the 1300s period. I mean, it was started by Hugh of Paynes, but, people like Saladin fascinated me in this. I didn't know too much about him other than that in that movie, but Saladin's an interesting character in that he was the one guy to pretty much unite the entire Muslim world under one leader. I mean, it's never been done. It wasn't done before that, and it hasn't really been done since. And he became such an interesting figure from the era because of his charisma, his strategy, his general skills as a leader, and he is a major part of the Crusades early on, and he butted heads with the Knights Templar many times, with him saying himself they were probably the most deadly force in the Catholic Crusaders. I mean, going from there, they worked with Richard the Lionheart. If you know English, history from its time and back in the day, Richard the Lionheart was like one of the great kings in English history, great strategist. He was a great warrior. Just one of the great kings that he was part of a crusade, which there were 7 of them. He was one of the middle periods, I believe it was the 4th or 3rd crusade, and he was a major force in trying to get the Holy Land back after they lost it to Saladin. A fascinating thing about the Templars is they became a bit of a early version of what you might see as Capital One, or as a banking institution where leaders and world leaders and heads of state gave them their money just to hold or prized possessions. Very fascinating stuff, and that's part of why they became so rich and wealthy and became such a major force in the world, especially Europe. Not maybe not so the world, but in Europe at that time. And Europe, for many, was the center of the world back in that time. Going from there, Frederick Hohenstaufen, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Emperor. He was an interesting figure, very different from Richard Lionheart and Saladin, much more of a thinker, less physical. Baybars, the great leader of the Mamelukes, the Mamelukes were a fascinating group in that they were African slave warriors who at one time were one of the key sects and warrior groups inside Saladin's army. His main bodyguard protectors, they end up uprising and they take over many parts of the Muslim world at the time. Fascinating stuff. King Philip IV, he becomes a real thorn in their side. He's the French king, helps to bring them down after 192 years. I mean, don't want to give too much away, but it's worth it. Fascinating read, fascinating book. You like history, like Knights Templars, like battles, like the Crusades, like warriors, and maybe even you like religion. This is the book for you. I highly recommend it. Dan Jones, The Templars. Till next time, I hope you enjoyed this Cheap Seats Chat review. Bye-bye.